if we then look at sort of the radio access network part of the telco business, it is quite clear that even though telco operators have got existing radio access networks, they need to build up capacity within those networks. They need to invest further for new technologies. And particularly as we move into the 5G space, there's the issues of having to pay for spectrum and then having to invest in radio equipment to take advantage of that spectrum. So clearly, irrespective of stripping out the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure side of things, there's still further capital investment required in the radio network. How do you think about that, Bora, particularly from a capital efficiency perspective?
I think it's very interesting permission because, as you rightfully said, I mean, yes, there is an infrastructure part, and most of these infrastructure owners and operators today are really coming from a real estate background. So they understand owning a tower, owning a brick and mortar data center, and basic supporting infrastructure on it in terms of security, power, or air conditioning and whatsoever. But they do not necessarily have the experience in engineering and networking from a telco or networking point of view. Now, that's where the traditional MNOs had strength because they have lots of in-house engineering capability, serving that networking aspect. Now, with the segregation of service provider going on the service side, infrastructure providers not necessarily having familiarity with deploying and operating networking equipment or networking services. Now, there is a layer in between. The question is whether that layer will be either fulfilled still by one of these players, or there will be a different layer of service providers over there, kind of, on the transmission world of telco, we used to have carrier of carriers type of operators, whether we will have this network infrastructure operators indeed who are bridging the gap between the infrastructure owners and the communication service providers. It is a likely possibility, and the technology, especially evolving to 5G, is really paving the way forward for that, because what 5G is all about is also quite a wide concept. It is really not one thing or one technology. It's a concept of things coming together. There are lots of techniques to improve the efficiency of operating a network. There is integrated aspects that allows network slicing and sharing on the radio access layer, which is allowing multi-operators to, basically operate on a single network and pull the resources in through functions like SDN and NFV as and when needed. So within that, scenario, then if we were to move into 5G, obviously it will make more sense for operators to share more and share more active equipment as well. And the question is then who is the party who is going to provide these networking services and all the capability over there, which is a complex engineering task.
So in the current South African context, there's clearly a need for additional spectrum, and there's been many arguments by the operators that is an impediment towards reducing the cost of data in the market. But one of the key challenges, I think, is the ability of network operators to truly share existing networks. So there are regulatory constraints around what type of sharing is permitted, or roaming, if you want to call it that. But true network sharing will then require a relook at the actual regulations and legislation around the sharing of spectrum. Why do you think the South African regulatory environment is not supportive to something that argues for a level of economic efficiency?
Well, I don't think it's unique to South Africa. I mean, it's in general, the regulators seems to, be focusing on more the problems of yesterday than the problems of future, because it's not because the intention is there. It is just that this sector has been evolving really fast. And for anyone, I mean, even people within the industry, it's really a challenge to follow up what's going on and how this evolution really impacts the economy and the dynamics and the competition on the market. So by the time regulators try to tackle a problem, that problem becomes a problem of yesterday. There are so much things happening, and the conversation has moved on from a technology point of view. So going forward, I guess, there is definitely a lot of work to be done within the current regulatory regime in South Africa to enable more efficient sharing of particularly spectrum and active networking. But on infrastructure side, to be honest, there is already ongoing sharing between the operators, between all the MNOs. They are almost barter trading their tower spaces, barter trading their indoor coverage systems and whatsoever. So there is already a sharing economy on the infra side. It is just a challenge of moving this to a layer higher in terms of networking and spectrum point of view, how more efficient sharing can be achieved over there. And that definitely requires a rehaul of all current regulatory environment over there.
I'd like to, to add to that. Just remember that a mere decade ago, any form of sharing wasn't going to happen. It just was non-existent, and I think the fiber industry, to a large extent, coming out with open access networks and facilitating active sharing, has sort of demolished a lot of the preconceived ideas about sharing and the impact that it has on your competitiveness. And I think we're seeing, the rise of the towercos that have, actively encouraged sharing and provided economic efficiencies. And I think that it will continue to happen deeper into the network as operators are under pressure to deploy other technologies like 5G, and not too far from 5G, we're already looking to 6G. I think it's certainly the fiber industry has played a very key role in proving that there's efficiencies, economic efficiencies, certainly in sharing of infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's also it's a bit of maturity of the market as well, because as a communication service provider, if I own the dominant infrastructure in the country, then if it is a strategic asset for me and my competitors do not have the same level of infrastructure, obviously I would want to leverage that, right? I wouldn't want to share and give it away. But when multiple operators have similar level of infrastructure, then that drives the sharing because it loses its strategic importance. And it happened on towers, it happened on fiber. At the beginning, we used to have only telecom on the national long calls, and there was a quite a big inefficiency in terms of the pricing, and that's why the cost of internet and communication was high. And what happened? Because of that challenge of having a monopoly, then the duplication of infrastructure happened by the likes of broadband infraco, introduced again by the government to break that monopoly. On the private sector side, we have seen the co-build between the several MNOs, again building the key routes in the country, and several others like FiberCos and all also joined that train. And that duplication indeed, where we say infrastructure duplication is a bad thing, through that duplication we achieved the cost reduction. So without the duplication of infrastructure, that wouldn't have happened. So that's probably another interesting area to elaborate as well, because there's this whole debate of whether it makes sense to overlay the infrastructure. I think it should be left to the market dynamics, because at the end of the day, market is in a free market. You have this dynamics of economy and returns from investment point of view, and without duplication, that wouldn't have been achieved, in my opinion.
So the market dynamics issue is for me a really interesting one, because 10 years ago, as Jonita, you were saying, infrastructure sharing was a Western markets phenomenon. It was not really present in the African context. The issue of active network sharing is certainly growing in terms of operators themselves realizing that sharing the active networks actually is beneficial to their business, because there's additional revenue potential, which then helps to make up for margin compression in terms of the consumer part of their business. How can the regulator, do you think, become more of an enabler in this and encourage what, in my mind, is a more economically efficient model of investment?
It's important to remember, like we spoke about earlier, that the current legislation was drafted around no sharing of infrastructure, and I think the regulator then saw that as effective and enabling a very competitive landscape at the time, so and a fair landscape. So if you wanted to be a provider of mobile services, then you had to build the tower, you had to put the backhaul in, you had to own the tower, you had to own the active. And I think that's how it was seen in the early days. That's how you had to compete.
It was a source of competitive advantage, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what it boiled down to was that the company with the deepest pockets, or the greatest investors behind them, would have had the lion's share of the market. But as the market has matured, I think the regulator has realized that there's a deep need to revisit current legislation and to relook it. And certainly we saw that in the ECA Amendment Act, that there were a very strong focus on open access networks and encouraging that and sharing of infrastructure at least. But I think that we've also recently had a change of guard, and there's deep faith in the current minister. She certainly has a lot of trust from the industry, and there's deep faith that she will, amend the legislation. But as like Bora mentioned, with a view to the future, to take a step 50 years into the future and say, where is this going and what do we need to enable to make sure that this is sustainable? Because amending legislation is an incredibly long and cumbersome process. So we need to revisit the current legislation through the ECA Amendment Act, which we hope will come back out again soon, and then to make sure that it enables this competitive environment that we would like to see in the future.